My daughter blocked me after the divorce, without hearing my side of the story. Now, 8 years later, she contacted me to claim my inheritance. I am 54, divorced from my 48-year-old wife for 8 years. My 28-year-old daughter cut all contact with me, choosing her mother's side without even asking how I felt. Although my divorce was nearly a decade ago, it took me a long time to accept how things unfolded and reconcile with my life. This was partly because my ex-wife tried to completely destroy my reputation, but mainly because I genuinely loved my daughter, and being entirely excluded from her life was harder than anything else. As she was an adult at that time, there was no way to be in her life unless she wanted it, and she seemed secure in her decision to choose her mother over me. I have no one else in my family besides my mother, who had Alzheimer's. So, all the suffering was definitely one of the worst things that ever happened to me. I tried to communicate with my daughter several times after the divorce, but she was determined to be on her mother's side and never even attempted to listen to my version of the story. At some point, my ex-wife contacted me and sued me for harassment. It was clear to me that if I didn't leave my daughter alone and stopped contacting her, I would face legal consequences. I spent the last 8 years taking care of my mother, focusing on my career, having some casual relationships here and there, but I feel like I can't fully trust another person after my divorce. Anyway, this has been my life for almost a decade. I apologize if I seem skeptical. The reason I'm writing this message is that my daughter recently contacted me after all this time. I felt elated and thought she finally came to her senses, understanding that the divorce wasn't solely my fault. It was comforting, especially because my mother recently passed away and I've been dealing with that grief alone. I was longing for some family comfort, so my daughter got in touch a few months after my mother's death. I received a call from an unrecognized number. I answered to hear a female voice on the other end, not knowing who it was. It was my daughter, and I didn't even recognize her voice since it had been so long since we last spoke, and I was quite surprised when she introduced herself. She said she saw on Facebook that her grandmother had passed away and wanted to know how I was. I was taken aback. I didn't even know she followed me online, and I found it sweet of her. I thanked her for calling and told her I was okay, besides expressing how much I missed her. We chatted a bit, and she mentioned that if I wanted to meet and really catch up in person instead of over the phone, she would like that. I was extremely happy and agreed immediately. We agreed to meet at my house over the weekend. I was genuinely excited to see her again after all these years, so I'm writing this message to share my excitement with whoever is reading, hoping that we can rebuild our relationship or at least get to know each other better. My daughter came to dinner because she wanted to cook for me. I was nervous and excited. When I opened the door for the first time, I simply didn't recognize her because it had been almost a decade since I last saw her, and she was just a child. We started talking, although it was a bit awkward at first. I think we both opened up after a while. She told me about her life and work. I told her about my life after dinner, and we finally acknowledged the elephant in the room. I asked her why she never cared to hear my side during the divorce. She automatically chose her mother. I admit her mother was more present as a mother because she was a homemaker, and at that time I worked in construction with long hours. Despite that, I always tried to dedicate as much time as possible to my daughter. She said she regrets how things happened and that she was too young to think about those things, being manipulated by the way her mother painted the situation. Basically, my ex-wife portrayed me as the villain who only cared about himself, and since she never heard my version, she never questioned what her mother told her. We talked a bit more about that, and things were going well until she finally revealed why she was there. We had already talked for hours at that point. When I asked her why she contacted me after all these years, she seemed a bit uncomfortable. I told her she could be honest with me. So, she said she had actually been following my life on Facebook, and when she found out her grandmother had passed away, she thought lawyers would contact her about the inheritance. Not hearing any news, she decided to contact me personally. She said she wanted to give me some time to grieve, but also mentioned that she recently got engaged and really needed money to help with wedding expenses. It was like a punch in the stomach. Honestly, I thought after all these years, my prayers had been answered, and I could have a family again, but it seems she never cared about me from the start, and all this was just a way to get the inheritance. The most ironic part is that it's not even her inheritance legally, it's all mine. If she hadn't been so terrible to me, she would definitely have gotten most of it. Still, I don't care about the money. I've never honestly cared. I live in my own house, have no luxuries, and mostly buy my clothes from budget stores. Even if the inheritance wasn't at stake, I wouldn't mind helping with the wedding in the first place. If she had approached the situation kindly, instead of trying to take advantage of me, only caring about the inheritance, all those thoughts went through my mind at the same time. However, somehow, I kept my composure and asked her if that was all she wanted. She got very defensive and said the inheritance was secondary. Her real goal was to reconnect with me. She would never forgive herself for not contacting me while her grandmother was alive, she claimed. She said she wanted to contact me for years but never had the courage because she thought I would never forgive her for kicking me out without an explanation, and she was also manipulated by her mother. But I could see by the panic in her face that she was trying to soften things so that I could forgive her, and I wondered if she was after the money. I asked her how she knew there was an inheritance, and she said that a few years before the divorce, she was visiting my late mother. She told her she wanted her to inherit everything left by my father, who passed away years ago, as she was the only granddaughter in the family. I have no siblings, and at that time, my marriage was going well, so I understand why my mother might have told her that. I mean, if the divorce never happened, or my daughter didn't abandon me for years after the divorce, the money would be hers, as I mentioned earlier. But the idea that she only cares about the money and gave me false hopes was absolutely devastating. I was shattered, but I did my best not to let her realize. At that moment, I thought the only way to test my daughter's intentions would be to see how she would react if I told her there was no money to inherit. I asked her when she expected the inheritance, and she made a pretty decent assumption. I could tell this whole situation had been carefully planned. So, I told her I'm sorry to disappoint her, but I actually inherited everything from my grandmother years ago, and I plan to use that money to start a business, so I couldn't help her by offering my own money for the wedding. The disappointment on her face confirmed my worst fears. She thanked me for the offer, but as the only granddaughter, she felt she deserved at least a portion of the inheritance since it's her grandmother's money being offered. I told her I would have liked to help her, but my decision was final, and there was nothing I could do for her if she wasn't satisfied with the money I was offering. She got completely red in the face and started visibly getting irritated. She told me again to reconsider my decision, but I reiterated that I would follow what seemed right to me, and that's when she showed her true colors and said something that confirmed all my doubts about her true intentions. She told me I should have known I would always be the selfish person her mother said I was and that she was glad I was alone in life. I looked at her with barely concealed disgust. Her words were painful, but at that moment, I knew what to expect. I just didn't expect it to be so brutally honest so quickly. That's it. She started saying something else, but I interrupted before she could speak. You can now check if there's a part 2 by pressing share and more.